G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. To acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and to encourage you all to see what you can do to help the voice this year. The referendum for a voice to Parliament will be coming, and we can all be a part of it and take up the wonderful invitation extended from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for Makarrata as well as voice. So just a few tips before we begin to help today run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for Adam and Richard. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions and make comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is live, but it is being recorded and it will be posted on our website later today. So after much negotiation, the Safeguard Mechanism legislation was officially passed in Parliament. It is Australia's first genuine national emissions reform in probably close to a decade. There were big problems with the government's proposed safeguard mechanism, but the Australian Greens secured a number of amendments to the legislation, including a hard cap on emissions that significantly improved the bill. The legislation obviously does not go far enough, and neither are the government's targets far enough to meet what the climate science demands to reduce emissions and avoid dangerous climate change. But there's many different elements to this safeguard mechanism. And so to discuss that in more detail, as well as the amendments that the Greens were able to secure, I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Adam Bandt, the federal member for Melbourne and leader of the Australian Greens. Adam is the Greens spokesperson for the climate emergency, energy and employment and industrial relations. And since becoming leader, Adam has really led the party's campaign for a Green New Deal. At the most recent election, the Greens increased their numbers in the lower house and in the Senate, and Adam led the negotiations with the government over this climate change legislation. We're so delighted to have you. Welcome today, Adam.
Thanks, Ebony.
And Adam will be joined in conversation by our Executive Director, Richard Dennis. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
So Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. As I kind of outlined there, the original safeguard mechanism legislation was a little bit problematic, to say the least. Didn't really put any barriers on no new coal and gas, one of the key things that you took to the election. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the Greens' concerns were with this legislation and what you've managed to negotiate with the government?
Yeah, thanks, Ebony, and thanks everyone for joining us. And acknowledge I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne. I just want to go back a bit and share a few slides with people, if I can, to explain where the safeguard was, what it was, why we had problems with it, and what we've been able to achieve. And to remind people to go back to the beginning, this was Tony Abbott's invented mechanism after he and a number of other senators abolished the carbon price, and which we'd put into place back in that 2010 Parliament. And what it is, the safeguard was that he put in place was a set of rules that are meant to apply to the biggest polluters in the country. Of course, under the old safeguard, they had notional limits put on them, each of these polluters, as to how much they could pollute. Every time they breached those limits, the government just lifted the limit, so that previously it wasn't working at all. The Labor government came along and said, they wanted to pick up Tony Abbott's mechanism, and they wanted to tighten the limits that were put on those polluters. The problem was that under Labor's proposed scheme, you could, if you breached the limit, or you had to, in order to comply with the limit, you could cut your pollution. Or you could just go and buy offsets, buy some tree planting permits or a promise not to cut down trees on the other side of the country, and that would count. And in terms of who these polluters are, just important to remember, although the government talked them up very much as your big manufacturers, and there are some big manufacturers in there, 57% of the emissions that are covered by the safeguard scheme are coal, oil and gas, right? So it's predominantly a scheme that regulates coal, oil and gas, with the minority, still a substantial minority, 43% of the emissions coming from manufacturers and other sort of big corporations in transport, for example. But your steel works and your glass works are some of the other entities that are covered, but they're not the majority, right? The majority are coal, oil and gas. And so I'm just going to see if I can share screen with you. I hope you can see that there and that's working. Getting a nod from Ebony. So where we started, as I say, so this was a scheme that's meant to regulate the coal, oil and gas. Where we started under Labor's original safeguard mechanism in 2023, the coal, oil and gas and the other corporations produce about 140 million tonnes a year of pollution. That was forecast to rise even under the safeguard. Now, I want to make a note. This is an illustrative graph. It's not to scale, so don't sort of take a screenshot of this and start measuring the area under the graph. We'll come back to that in a moment. But in terms of the numbers, the 140 million tonnes, as we know, there's 116 to 118 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline in Australia. If all of those coal projects and some of the gas projects went ahead, there were estimates, reputable estimates, that you could see up to 184 million tonnes of pollution coming from the areas covered by the safeguard in the year 2030. So in other words, when Labor designed the scheme, pollution from coal and gas was set to rise. Why? Well, firstly, because unlimited numbers of new coal and gas mines could keep opening up. Secondly, all of the coal and gas in the scheme could keep increasing its pollution. All they had to do was buy those offsets. So those environment-based offsets are around not chopping down trees or planting trees, those kind of offsets. So pollution from coal and gas was set to rise. Now, would all of those 116 coal and gas projects be opened up? Well, they were all on the government's books. But even under the government's own figures, which were more conservative than the 184 megatons in 2030, the government was predicting a rise. So the government's own climate policy, Labor's own climate policy, said pollution from coal and gas would set to rise. Why? For those two reasons. They keep opening new coal and gas mines, and the new coal and gas mines that open are allowed, that are underway, are just allowed to offset all their pollution. So whatever estimate you take, pollution was going to go up from coal and gas under Labor's safeguard. What the Greens have done is secure a big change to the safeguard that will mean, we estimate, about half of those 116 coal and gas projects on the books won't be able to go ahead. Why? Because whereas the government was talking about offsetting and a net cut in pollution, which actually sees real pollution, the thing that matters to the climate crisis, rise, as you can see on this graph, what we've negotiated is basically this. There will now be a hard cap, what's called a hard cap on pollution. And that means the areas covered by the safeguard, the corporations, by law, can now not increase above the 140 million tonnes that we've got a year, and in fact must come down. It basically must come down effectively year on year, and I'm happy to talk about the sort of the detailed way in which that happens. There will be a built-in capacity for variations, for natural variations, but it is clear that it is now in law that the scheme has to be designed so that real pollution comes down. That means, on our estimate, about half of those 116 projects in the pipeline just can't go ahead, right? Because there won't be space for them under the new hard cap. So that's the first thing we've done, is actually ensured that real pollution will start to fall. Further, there's now something else that we've been able to negotiate, which we're calling a safeguard trigger. So in this remaining, I guess, carbon limit, if you want to call it that, where it's got to come down from 140 megatons underneath the cap, the government has the power now to restrict or effectively stop new projects from coming into the scheme. And so how it's going to work is this: the government now, every time is now going to get advice about the new projects, which are new coal and gas projects, or it could be a new lithium mine, or it could be a new manufacturing facility that is coming in. The government's going to get advice about how polluting these new projects are going to be. If new projects are going to come in that could start lifting Australia's pollution again, bearing in mind that under what we've negotiated, it has to fall, real pollution has to fall, not rise. If they get advice that, look, hang on, some of these big new projects, and it could be a coal or a gas project, are so massive that it's actually going to lift pollution, then the minister has to take action, right? And the minister has to ensure that pollution doesn't go back up above where it is and it's falling. And that could include putting significant restrictions on them, including saying, look, this big new gas project that's coming in, I'm sorry, there's not space for you in the scheme anymore because you're actually going to start lifting Australia's pollution again. So the minister has the power now to impose restrictions and conditions that could effectively restrict or halt new projects that are in the pipeline. And that's going to be critical over the next little while. And that's the first time that's happened. So for the first time ever, the minister would have the power to restrict or stop new projects on the basis that they're going to lift pollution. And that's never been there in law before. We've also managed to negotiate some significant handbrakes on the BAROSSA and BEETALOO gas fields that mean that the BEETALOO project, which I just was talking about these new projects and how much they could lift pollution. Well, BEETALOO on one estimate could lift yearly pollution by between 11 and 13%, depending on that's evidence that's been given in court proceedings. Now, so that's the kind of threat they pose to Australia's emissions and the world emissions. BEETALOO project is going to be required to offset all its emissions from the beginning, not just the 5% that Labor was proposing, but all its emissions, and going to be required to offset its Scope 2 and its Scope 3 domestic emissions as well, which on some estimates could be around $1 billion a year additional costs facing the BEETALOO, which we think could effectively derail the business case. The BAROSSA project, which is being fought by the Tiwi Islanders as well, is also going to have to be net zero CO2 from the beginning, which will impose additional costs on them as well. We managed to stop many of the dodgy offsets by freezing the offsets that can be created from a number of projects that had been found under the government's review to be especially dodgy. They're not going to be allowed to create new projects and new offsets until they've lifted their game. I just want to say on offsets, though, we still don't believe that you can offset your way out of the climate crisis. And that's why the hard cap is so important, because no matter how many offsets these corporations buy, the hard cap still sits over the top of it all, right? So you can't go above the hard cap now, no matter how many offsets you buy. We've also ensured that the government's going to review how methane is measured, because we think that a more accurate measure of methane, which is such a toxic CO2 gas in the short term, will limit the amount of methane that can be put into the atmosphere, and there's going to be sector by sector pathways to net zero. So that's that's in a summary. Stopped about half of the projects in the pipeline. We're going to be capping pollution, ensure bringing it down. A big blow to the BEETALOO and BAROSSA gas projects. New coal and gas projects have to meet new hurdles and the new trigger. We've reined in some of the dodgy offsets, the methane monitoring there. We've also managed to stop the government using a pile of buckets of public money for directly funding coal and gas, and we're going to be speeding up the transition across the sectors. So that's it in summary. In terms of where to from here, yes, like in less than a year of this new parliament, stopped a huge chunk of those new coal and gas projects from going ahead. Now we want to come after the rest. The minister's now got the power to stop a number of those. We want to see a climate trigger in our environment laws, which are going to come up at the end of this year, so that the environment laws are another way of stopping new coal and gas projects. We want the budget to stop subsidising fossil fuel projects directly. We've managed to stop a lot of the stop a lot of the direct funding, but there's a lot of indirect funding that they get. And I guess the last thing I would say is that from now, it's clear that what we're going to need to do is ramp up the public campaigns as well against these new coal and gas projects, because we know that there's still a bunch that the government wants to open. There are strong community campaigns being run against those. We're going to join, I guess, shoulder to shoulder with all of those people trying to stop those new projects, because the climate science is clear. We couldn't get the government to accept all of the climate science, but we forced them to swallow a bit of a dose of reality about coal and gas. But we all know that the next act now has to be to stop them from opening the rest of the coal and gas projects.
Yeah, Richard, if I can come to you after that pretty comprehensive presentation from Adam. I mean, the Australia Institute was pretty fiercely critical of the safeguard mechanism as it existed. How do you think it lands in terms of where we need to be to meet the climate science?
Oh, I guess first, I mean, what else did you get, Adam? I mean, yeah, look, it's actually great to see it spelled out like that. And it's been fascinating to watch a whole bunch of people that have been saying the Greens should just pass the bill, saying, why didn't you get more? So, yeah, it's important to note that here we are in Australia with some actual binding cap on emissions again. And we've gone down this path before, but in some ways we've never gone this far down this path before. There's an actual barrier now to the opening of new coal and gas that's never been there before. So unfortunately, what gets left out of the Australian public debate about climate change is that we are the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. Number one, Saudi Arabia. Number two, Russia. Number three, Australia. And for decades, successive governments, Labor and Liberal, state and federal, have kind of had this kabuki play where they talk about, domestic emission reduction policies, which are significant. Of course, Australia needs to reduce Australia's domestic emissions, but these sort of fights about renewable energy in Australia have been used to completely obscure a fight about whether we really want to be in the business of expanding fossil fuel production in Australia in the 21st century. So I think it's actually quite historic to have finally witnessed that. And I think that, interestingly, after the Aston by-election and the New South Wales state election, I really think the 2025 federal election will focus more on, does Australia really think you need more coal mines to tackle climate change? No disrespect to the Greens, have been trying to get people to talk about this for a long time. I really think that having forced this debate on the safeguard mechanism, I really think that come the next election, that's where the fight will go. So, are carbon credits, do they have integrity in Australia? No. Even if they had integrity, there's no role for using any carbon credits to justify fossil fuel expansion. The science is really clear. We need to stop burning fossil fuels and plant as many trees and save as many trees as we can. The and does all the work. The whole point of offsetting is to say it's okay to burn more fossil fuels if you planted a tree or maybe claim to have saved one. So, look, I'm old-fashioned. I think Australia needs to reduce fossil fuel production, reduce fossil fuel consumption, stop subsidising fossil fuels, stop native forest logging, stop subsidising native forest logging, and maybe, God forbid, invest in some public transport and active transport. So there's still a lot to do, but it's kind of, I hate to say it, but there's no point doing that stuff if we can't stop fossil fuel expansion. If the bathtub's overflowing and the bathroom's a mess, you could turn the tap off, or you could design a bigger plug hole. We've got to stop debating the theoretically optimal size of the plug hole. We need to turn the tap off. We need to turn the fossil fuel tap off as fast as we can, and we need to tidy up the mess.
Adam, I wanted to come back to you because as Richard said, these negotiations have been happening for kind of quite some time, and it seems like a real achievement to get the hard cap here, and something that we haven't seen before. How important is the changed composition of the parliament and the kind of the climate election that we saw last year had on the negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's made a real difference, because there were a number of voices pushing for what we've been pushing for. Like, there was some other crossbenchers in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well, some of the independents who had been pushing for this. And this is something Australia Institute's been pushing for a while, but also along with a number of other scientists and experts as well have been saying, that point that Richard in his ways is like able to really eloquently put really simply, but which is that it does come down to the simple issue of coal and gas, and that's what's making the problem worse, and that's what's driving it. And in this parliament, we've got more voices willing to put that on the table. I think the penny kind of still hasn't dropped for the government yet, and it was a real effort to, I guess, get them to agree to understand that actually the pollution coming from coal and gas is the issue, and you can't just deal with everything by way of offsets. Like, there is still a really strong desire there. I mean, the coal and gas corporations still do have their hooks into the old parties, but having more voices in Parliament and having after the last election is actually starting to break some of that apart. Because when you think about it, now you've got, Tony Abbott used to be the member for Warringah, and now you've got a member for Warringah who's prepared to stand up and say, we can't keep opening up coal and gas mines. And I think that just shows that the parliament is now a bit more reflective of the Australian population being willing to have even a more science-based approach to climate than Labor, than the government, even from formerly Liberal seats. And I think the penny hasn't dropped quite yet from the government that they could actually even go further than what we've been able to get them to do, and they'd still have the support of the people, and you'd have a huge number of parliamentarians like there in the Senate, but also in the House of Representatives, willing to get that legislation that does something more through.
Yeah. And Richard, as Adam has said, this is kind of only just the beginning, but I did just want to focus on fossil fuel exports, which you mentioned earlier, because the reality is we can build new renewable energy, all of that kind of good stuff that we absolutely have to do. But it's no good just to look at our domestic emissions. At some point, Australia has to really tackle those exports and the role that we're playing in exporting climate change around the world.
Look, absolutely. And I mean, let's start with the science. It doesn't matter where in the world Australian coal gets burned, it harms our climate. It harms our reef. It makes our floods worse. It makes our bushfires worse. So we have these kind of accounting tricks, this distinction between Scope 1 emissions, which are things that sort of happen here, and Scope 3 emissions for coal. Doesn't matter, that's burned overseas. So we've got these accounting distinctions, but there's no scientific distinction. And here we are literally selling the coal and gas to the rest of the world that will harm our reef, that will fuel our fires, that will fuel our floods. So step one, there's the science. Step two, there's the short-term economics. The biggest user of gas in Australia, the absolute biggest user of gas, is the export gas industry. We use more gas to liquefy and compress gas than we use for anything else. So, all this talk about gas shortages, well, that's easy fix. Let's just stop exporting gas. I promise we'll have heaps, no problem there. And then there's the long-term economics, and that is Australia is one of the few countries in the world still kind of planning for a fossil-fueled future. Like, we're still fantasizing that our economy might reap benefits from fossil fuel exports in 2040 and 2050, when, of course, the rest of the world, that anyone who can, is trying to set themselves up for a different future. Now, look at the US. Is it still drilling for oil? Yes, but it's piling money into renewable energy, into the hydrogen economy, into batteries, because it wants to be a leader when the fossil fuels run out. Yet here we are in Australia still spending $12 billion a year subsidising this emission-intensive, job-unintensive industry that pays virtually no tax. So whether you want to look after our climate, whether you want to look after our economy, maybe you want to look after both, we've got to wean ourselves off these fossil fuels. But unfortunately, look how hard we've had to fight to get these significant restrictions in. But still, still a country that subsidises fossil fuel expansion, and a resources minister bragging about, how there's decades worth of fossil fuels to come if she can deliver it.
We're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second, and I can see we've got more than 700 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. You can pop your questions for Adam and Richard into the Q&A box, and please, if you can upvote questions that you would really like answered, that's useful to me as the host. Thanks so much. Adam, I did just want to come to a couple of other issues before we go to questions from the audience. One is the recent anti-trans rally that we saw in Melbourne, and you being the member for Melbourne and the Greens, really standing up for trans rights. I just wondered what your response is to that, and if you think the Liberal Party has gone far enough in its response.
Yeah, it's really distressing to see that on the steps of Parliament, and also to see neo-Nazis on our Parliament steps as well. And one of the things that I'll come back to the anti-trans, but with the neo-Nazis, I mean, one of the things that security agencies were warning under the previous government for some time is that that white supremacy and the far right is on the rise in Australia, and it's one of our biggest security threats. And of course, the previous government refused to name it, refused to use the word far right extremism, and instead just when they got that warning, their response in part was to change the language to talk about politically motivated violence, as if somehow you're seeing that on other parts of the political spectrum. So, but seeing that manifest in Parliament, on the steps of Parliament, is really distressing. But also, I'd like to come back to your question about the Liberal Party and the trans community. Like, they are really, we saw it during the federal election, and we're seeing it again, them taking some steps now, but also sections flirting with that anti-trans community as well. And I think, the Liberal Party, they love to punch down, right? And I've been a bit heartened, can I say, by the response in Victoria and in Melbourne, broadly across the political spectrum, with some of those notable exceptions that I've mentioned, saying that there's no place for hate, and we're not going to allow our community to be weaponized for political purposes. And it feels like, and you look at what happened down in Hobart, where Hobart was apparently the worst place in the world for that speaker until she went to New Zealand. So it seems that Hobart didn't hold that title for long enough, in my view. But it feels like increasingly there's a shift in the population to say, nah, we don't want that kind of hate-based politics anymore. And I'm sure there will be some who will continue to fight against the trans community, and against others. And I hope that we're starting to see the beginning of the end of it.
And just if you can touch quickly on the Aston by-election results, do you feel like some of that ugliness translated into the defeat for the Liberals that we saw at the Aston by-election on the weekend?
Oh, look, I think it played a role. And I mean, let's not forget that Peter Dutton was the guy who said that people in Melbourne were scared to go out for dinner because of African gangs a few years ago, when that just wasn't the experience of people here, and people saw through it for the racism that it was. And I think that that approach from the conservative side of politics to pick particular groups and use them for political fodder is wearing very, very thin. And I think you saw, and that's why I say I feel a sort of a bit of optimism that people are starting including in Victoria, are starting to reject it. And like I remember when I first got elected in 2010, I would go to events in the community, and there would be a Liberal minister from the state government or former Liberal ministers who would get up and say, oh, look, one of the good things about Victoria is that you're not going to see people use race for political gain. That fell away while, during that last decade, we saw that fall away, and the Liberal Party try to weaponise that along with others like One Nation. But it's starting to feel like it's had its day. But it doesn't mean they won't keep trying. And I think part of our job in Parliament is to be vigilant and stamp it out wherever we see it.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. And the first couple that I've got here are questions around the hard cap. So Cormac and Peter are asking for a bit more detail. Build as your main win. Bowen is saying if the cap is reached, he'll be free to amend the rules or potentially even wave them through according to reporting in the financial review. And Peter's question is around a mechanism and what future governments might be able to do with the cap. So if you can just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks for that. And there's a couple of different kinds of terminology that are being used there that it's important to be clear about. So the cap itself will be in legislation. And it'll say, so it says now in legislation, with that legislation having passed this week, that pollution now needs to decline, and there's a way of measuring that. So you take, you don't take it strictly from one year to the next, because there might be natural variations that mean that one goes up, one goes down. You take an average in 1 year, you take an average in the next year, and it's basically got to start coming down. So that's in law. One of the things that will happen in the legislation is that the minister gets advice when there are big projects underway, say through the EPBC Act, the environment laws, where they've got to now start reporting their emissions. And the Climate Change Authority is also required to now scan ahead and look at big potentially polluting projects that are in the pipeline and then advise the minister. The minister then has to, when they get that information, and it's the Minister for Climate Change and Energy who's responsible for this, who will be overseeing this, when the minister gets all of that information, they then got to look and say, well, is the cap likely to be breached in the future based on these new entrants coming into the scheme? And if so, what am I going to do about it? And the point that I think the minister was making that might have led to that question that was being asked is that one of the things they might have to do is redesign the whole scheme. That's where, and I think they use the phrase around changing the rules. So it's not changing the rules as in change the rules of the game so you don't have to follow the rules anymore. It's potentially have to amend the scheme. So the minister will have some choices, right? And this is important to understand, because for the participants who are already in the scheme, the minister could theoretically, if they want to, say, oh, I'm sorry, the steelworks has to be shut down to make way for a new gas mine. Or they could say, oh, well, I've got a lithium mine and a new gas project that both want to come in. I know lithium is important for batteries. Which one am I going to let in? What conditions am I going to impose on each of them? So they can't change the rules to get out of the hard cap, but they can take action within the scheme. And I think, there's, I think it would be, this will pose some challenges for Labor if they want to keep opening up these new projects, because they might have to decide whether it is a gas project or a lithium project that comes into the scheme and what restrictions they're going to put on them. There's other things that they could potentially do, like they might decide, oh, look, actually, emissions are rising too fast or potentially going to rise too fast. Let's invest substantially to get the steelworks off metallurgical coal onto making green steel, for example. That might be something that they decide to do, and that would be open to them to do that as well. But they can't change the rules to get out of the cap.
Richard, I know you've kind of talked about the nature of those debates and problems that Labor will now confront in similar terms, but kind of talking about that these are decisions that governments previously hadn't had before at all.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, let's face it, in Australia for decades, it's just been open slather. You want to build a coal mine? Sure. Someone else wants to build a coal mine? Sure. How about a gas mine? Yeah, let's have one of them too. Lithium, why not? What the hard cap does is create a budget. It says, and you know, to be clear, we need to be more ambitious than that. That was as far as this parliament could come. But the science says Australia needs to drop its emissions far faster. But absent the hard cap, there was actually no cap. Absolute emissions were just free to go up. So, yeah, we've now got a hard cap that's going to force the government to have to make some hard decisions. And those hard decisions may well be, all right, we've got room under the cap for a lithium mine. We've got room under the cap for lithium refinery. But someone else wants to build a big gas project. Let's be clear, because we don't have an economy-wide carbon price, like every economist in the world thinks we should, because we haven't got a simple economy-wide carbon price, we've now got the situation where a minister might have to choose between a new coal project and a new lithium project. Now, that's better than not having to choose, but it's probably not the job that Chris Bowen wanted to give himself. But if Australia wants to cap its emissions, which the Parliament has now said it will, then it follows that someone has to make decisions about what will fit under that cap and what won't. So that, I think the economics of that, you know, someone should ask the West Australian Chamber of Minerals whether they're on the side of gas expansion or lithium refinery, because someone's going to have to choose. And then putting the economics aside, let's be clear about the politics as well. If Labor and the Liberal Party or anyone wants to go to the next election saying, you know, I want to make a lot more room for a lot more coal and a lot more gas, why don't you vote for me? Because we're going to blow this carbon budget thing up if you vote for me. Well, let's please put that to the public, because my instinct combined with a hell of a lot of opinion polling says that the voters think that's a really crap idea. So the hard cap will force some hard choices, but actually, hopefully, it forces some hard democratic conversations as well. And I think I know what the end result of those democratic conversations will be.
The next questions that I've got that are similar are from John Knox and Sue Ellen Smith, and they're both talking or asking questions around well, John's asking about will the government be using new methane detecting satellites to confirm that methane emissions are as reported? And Sue Ellen Smith is asking about the auditing of things like the BEETALOO and other and existing projects within the safeguard mechanism rules for compliance. Is there anything that you want to shed light on that, Adam?
Well, just that it'll be the responsibility of the department to now begin the process. They've now got to go through and set, because of the way in which Labor's wanted to do this, they'll have to go through and set what they call baselines for each of the sectors, which are based on an assessment of how much pollution is actually coming out. With respect to methane, like specifically, there is currently underway a big review going on about how internationally methane pollution is being measured, and there's a general consensus that it is not being measured properly. And things like the satellite data that are being mentioned are going to feed into that. And the Climate Change Authority is obviously going to have the capacity to advise on this as well. But that broader review about whether we're measuring methane properly, including those things, is now underway. And we're going to have to keep the pressure up to ensure that review is done properly. And because if we can start getting the accurate measurements that currently aren't being recorded in law into law, which is the intention of this deal, but we're going to have to keep the pressure up to ensure that happens. That's going to have a big impact, not only for those gas projects that are big and quite leaky, but one of the things that we were able to get in this agreement is that obviously, if we can get measurement of methane to be more accurately recorded, that's also going to affect a lot of coal mines as well, because a lot of coal mines leak out huge amounts of methane. and it's one of the biggest sources of methane pollution. So it'll start to bite on coal as well if we can get that methane measurement tidied up.
Richard, anything you want to add to that?
Oh, just that, look, unfortunately, for decades we've been lied to about all sorts of things. The way that we've estimated methane emissions would, surprise, surprise, underestimate how much methane's been coming out. And of course the industry's spent decades saying there's no need to look harder. Just as when we looked hard, we found there was a lot of wage theft going on out there. I think in 5 years' time, we'll find out there's been a lot of carbon pollution theft out there. That is big polluters just flat out lying about how much was really coming out. So the more information we get, the better. But the reality is, when it turns out that they're putting out even more than we realised, that's all the more reason to have these hard caps in place, because just buying more dodgy offsets to compensate for your dodgy account keeping when it comes to methane isn't going to tackle climate change. The science is really simple. We need to put less CO2, less methane into the atmosphere, and we need to do it fast.
The next question that I've got is or two similar ones again, one from Lenka and another one from Belinda, really asking about consequences for both the minister and for companies if they breach this new law, essentially. So you were talking about the obligation on the minister, Adam, but Belinda is also asking, what are the consequences for companies if they try and wiggle their way out of caps?
Yeah, so the this offsetting scheme, which we don't think is the way of really dealing with the climate crisis, as we've said, the way of dealing with the climate crisis is to tackle coal and gas. This offsetting scheme still continues to exist, and companies are allowed to meet their obligations to cut pollution by 5% a year by buying offsets, but that all sits under the hard cap, okay? So if they don't buy enough offsets or they don't cut their pollution, they have to pay a penalty. I think it's about $275 as opposed to the roughly $75 a tonne that is the cap for these offsets. But that all sits under the hard cap, and the hard cap covers all of the corporations put together, the coal, gas and oil and the others, right? And it is the minister's responsibility to ensure that hard cap isn't breached, and it'll be legally binding. So if the minister is not taking steps to ensure that pollution remains below the hard cap, then they're breaching the law, right? They're breaking the law that says they've got to have a scheme in place that ensures that pollution is coming down year by year. And so that's something that would be, is enforceable. So because it's in there, it is in the law. So there's two sets of consequences, I guess. There's the obligations that are for the companies, but that's within the broader trading scheme bit, which again, we don't think is terrific. But that sits under the hard cap. So the hard cap puts a limit really on the usefulness of permits, because you can buy as many permits as you want, but the whole scheme's got to sit under the hard cap, and the minister's got to set the restrictions to deal with that.
Richard, I wonder if you just might briefly tell us, the Australia Institute has done quite a lot of work around why offsets are problematic. Could you just give people a little summary of what we've found?
Yeah, sure. Look, so when people hear about offsets, they often think about tree planting. They think, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we paid someone to plant some trees, and when the trees grow, they soak up some carbon dioxide, and then, that'd be good. And to be clear, we do need to plant a lot of trees, and we need to stop chopping down a lot of trees. But step one, people need to understand that of all the offsets generated in Australia, less than 2% have got anything to do with tree planting. Right? It's not about tree planting. Tree planting is the nice fairy tale that we tell to help people understand all the good things that are happening. But as is often the case, we use the little story to hide the big story. The vast majority of credits in Australia come from from people making up stories about what they were going to do. So, for example, there's something called the avoided deforestation credits, and avoided deforestation credits are issued when someone who was just about to chop a tree down promises to not chop that tree down. So imagine you went out to your backyard, you find yourself a tree, and you tell yourself you're going to chop it down, and then you tell yourself, oh, maybe I won't chop it down, and then someone wrote you a check for not doing it. So avoided deforestation credits in Australia are one of the biggest methods. And of course, since we started the avoided deforestation method, most of the projects are in Western New South Wales and Southwestern Queensland. You know what's happened to land clearing in those areas? It's gone up. We're actually clearing more land in the area where these projects are supposedly avoiding deforestation. Why could that be? Well, because clearing land's quite expensive. And as one recipient of these projects made clear on an ABC radio interview, he was driving along and he was showing the journalist about, this paddock that he hadn't chopped the trees down for, that he got all the money for. And the journalist said, what did you do with the money? And he pointed to the other paddock. He said, I cleared that one. So unfortunately, these accounting tricks might generate money for someone, but let's again remind ourselves what the science says. We need to grow a lot more trees and burn a lot less fossil fuels. The and does all the work. But we've created an idea in Australia where it's okay to burn more fossil fuels. It's okay to extract more gas if someone plants a tree, or more likely someone promises to not chop a tree down. So the science says we've got to do everything we can. The science says we've got to sequester carbon in the landscape and stop pumping so much pollution into the sky. But what the offsets are doing is kind of giving moral and economic legitimacy to fossil fuel expansion because someone promised to not harm a tree. So our research, the ANU's research, ABC did a wonderful four corners into similar things happening in Papua New Guinea. The Guardian did a big expose recently on credits around the world. Pretty much anyone that's looked has found the same thing. Most of these credits are hot air. And the problem is that this hot air is being used to greenwash the idea that it's okay to expand fossil fuels.
Adam, the next questions that I've got are similarly linked. Jeff Wilson asks, when do you think the weight of the electorate will exceed the weight of the fossil fuel lobby? Excuse me. And Caroline Skelly asks, how cooperative were the Teals and Tanya Plibersek in the negotiations? Just touching again on that idea of, I guess, how much the parliament has changed.
Yeah, I think this is what I was getting to about the point about the penny not having dropped with the government. They could do a lot more than this. The final bits of the discussion came in the same week as the UN Secretary General and the IPCC delivered their final warning and said, and the UN Secretary General singled out countries like Australia and just said very clearly, you've got to stop opening coal and gas. Like that was his plea to basically to the developed countries. And you would have thought in that situation, sitting down with the government, like they just say, oh yeah, okay, we agree with the science. What can we do about it? But it wasn't. Like it's like, yes, the discussions were in good faith, but that good faith means where the other one is coming from, and it's pretty clear that with this government, it's like negotiating with the political wing of the fossil fuel industry, right? And they still think that opening more coal and gas mines is a good idea. And in that context, having others in Parliament saying no, it's not, was enormously helpful. But the government as a whole are still doing, especially after the last election, they think that opening more coal and gas mines is a good idea, right? And so, and that is the government position. And so I don't sort of really want to pick sort of one minister off from another. Like the government's position is what matters, and the government's position is that they want they still think that they're not yet prepared to say, oh, we're going to stop opening coal and gas and do what the science requires. But it feels like, and this is why I think what we've achieved here is so significant, because it feels like for the first time, things are changing. And like I've seen some of the comments in the chat, like it's right. The government's targets are not, the government's targets mean the Paris Agreement temperature goals get breached, right? The government's targets are based on exceeding 2 degrees of heating. Like, let's just be crystal clear about that. And, the end of the reef, significant damage to Australia, let alone what it means for our Pacific Island neighbours. Like, the government is not acting in accordance with the science. And to act in accordance with the science, which is what I think most people want, we'd actually need to not just stop opening up new ones, but talk about how we're going to phase out existing ones, right? That's what we would need to do. So yes, it's right that where the government still wants to go is not consistent with what the science requires. But I think especially people who've been fighting for climate action for a long time, should kind of have a bit of a spring in their step as a result of this, because actually for the first time, we've shown that it's possible to start reining in the coal and gas corporations. Like, do we need to do more? Yeah, absolutely we do. But that's why I said at the start that actually the majority of the pollution covered by this safeguard scheme is from the coal and gas and oil corporations. Like, that's primarily what we've done. And so whereas the curve was going like this and up and up and up, we've managed to start to flatten it, right? Which is what we need to do to tackle the climate crisis. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. And what we're going to need, and I agree with some of the comments in the chat, that now that we've given that there's new legislative tools to stop some of these coal and gas mines, what we're going to need is to redouble effectively building a movement to make the government do it. Because how do we get the people power to win over the coal and gas lobby? Well, we've just had a big blow, but we need to make the government more afraid of losing seats and losing the support of the people than they are of the coal and gas corporations. And so to get where we need to go with the science, we are going to need a big campaign now, between now and the next election, to get that question of coal and gas squarely on the agenda, so that governments think, oh, I could open a new gas mine, but I'll lose my seat. I'll lose about 5 seats over here, so I'm not going to do it.
And that brings me to almost our last questions. I do want to ask you about voice before we go, but there are a number of questions that ask about our big exports, our fossil fuel exports, and how Scope 3 emissions under the safeguard mechanism.
Yeah, so Scope 3 emissions are critical. So that's when the coal or gas gets burnt somewhere else, right? And it could be in Australia, it could be overseas. As Richard says, it doesn't matter where it burnt. It all harms our country. It all harms the planet. The Scope 3 domestic emissions will get taken into account for the BEETALOO. This scheme, the government was insistent on it, regulates only Scope 1 emissions. But the thing, why this is so significant, is that Australia's Scope 1 emissions are someone else's Scope 3 emissions, right? And so if we can, you've got to take into account it all. And that's what we're hoping for, that our environment laws will do. We think you've got to take into account, doesn't matter where the coal or gas is burned, it harms, it contributes to climate damage, you should take it into account. But if we can, through this safeguard, limit Australia's Scope 1 emissions, we're actually also limiting Scope 3 emissions, because most of the scheme covers coal and gas. And that is why it's so significant. So not only by doing this have we prevented that little wedge of Scope 1 emissions opening up, but massive multiples of Scope 3 emissions are also prevented from doing that, because Australia is a big exporter of fossil fuel pollution. Restrict our Scope 1s, we restrict the world's Scope 3s.
Richard, can I come to you on that quickly as well? Because would I be right in saying, you were talking before about the fact that we export massive amounts of LNG overseas, and that would be when it's burnt, Scope 3, but actually domestically we use quite a lot of and burn quite a lot of gas just to export it. So is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, if Australia wanted to rapidly reduce our own domestic Scope 1 emissions, we should shut down gas exports, because it's the major user of gas in Australia. So limiting gas exports means limiting the amount of gas we have to burn to export the gas, and that's an easy win for us. But yeah, Adam and I are on a unity ticket here. The minute the gas leaves our shore and someone else burns it, we say, oh, that's scope 3. They call it scope 1 when they plug it into their power station. We've only got one climate, you know, and these accounting rules were invented by the fossil fuel industry to kind of create these bizarre divisions. The science is really simple. The UN Secretary General is really simple. And I actually think the politics are really simple. There are no coal mines in capital cities. There are no gas fracking in capital cities. Look at where elections are now won and lost in Australia. It's a democracy. Our constitution doesn't mention being nice. It doesn't mention climate change. It doesn't mention evidence-based. It just talks about how we choose who gets elected and what they're allowed to do. And, you know, if people stop voting for people who want to vote for new coal and gas, we'll be able to fix this. It's a pity that the science hasn't persuaded the majority of both houses of parliament that we need to stop all new coal and gas, because the science is clear. The science hasn't persuaded these parliamentarians, but we do live in a democracy. Hopefully voters will.
And Adam, just finally, you know, First Nations communities here in Australia and across the world are often on the front lines of climate change impacts. A lot of fossil fuel projects are on Aboriginal land in Australia. And we do have this referendum on the voice to Parliament coming up. We've seen that legislation introduced into the Parliament this week. How do you think things are going for the voice, and what's the Greens' position on that going forward?
Well, the Greens want to see all of the elements of the statement from the heart implemented: truth, treaty, and voice. And so in our discussions on the voice, we managed to get some important concessions and clarifications from the government about sovereignty not being undermined with the voice referendum being successful, and also getting the government starting to move on treaty as well. So with supporters of the campaign, we want to see it succeed. It'll be an important step on the road to First Nations justice in this country. But as you say, it's First Nations communities that are in many respects on the front line. A lot of the battles, like in the Beetaloo, in Scarborough in Western Australia, it's Tiwi Islanders taking on the campaign around BAROSSA, who've all, we joined some of them for our own town hall webinar a little while ago, and they're all really buoyed by another blow being delivered against these projects that they're trying to stop. Want to see not only a successful outcome to the referendum, but want to see First Nations peoples in this country have real say over what happens on their country from these coal and gas corporations. And we're going to keep fighting with them side by side to ensure that their voices, which they're making pretty clear now, what they want, get heard.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's amazing questions, but thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your time, Adam Bandt and Richard Dennis. And you'll be able to find this video up on our website later today. Please thank Adam Bandt and Richard Dennis for joining us today. Thank you everyone for your magnificent questions, and please make sure you're subscribed to our Follow the Money podcast. Our last episode was explaining the safeguard mechanism and the outcome with the Greens. And this week we're going to be talking to Cos Samaras about the implications of the Aston by-election results. So tune in for that one. Thanks everyone for your time today. We had more than 1,000 people registered, so huge interest in reducing Australia's emissions. We appreciate you all coming along and engaging today. Take care, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Eb. Thanks, Adam.